that we're gonna do the thing. So this is, if you're gonna cut something, cut now ish, whatever. You get where I'm going. All right. Hi there. I'm Chris Natsuume. I am the what am I? I'm the creative director of Boomzap. We are a studio making a game called Last Regiment. If you're interested in that, all the details are down there, but I don't want to talk too much about that because I want to keep this useful to you. What I want to talk about today is I have been working with artists now. I've been in the game industry 25, 20. I don't know. I started in 1992, so whatever that makes. It's 90 what 2019 now, so do the math. I've been making games a really long time, and I have worked in the industry as a level designer, as a lead designer, as a producer, and for the last 15 or 16 years, I have been running a game studio called Boomzap as the creative director, which is kind of a cross between being a producer and the designer of a lot of games. Now, in my career, I have made 50 some odd, 50 something games. I've actually lost count. Uh, Here at Boomzap, I think we've made over 50 games, and in almost all of them, I was working directly with the artists in determining how the games were going to look. That's part of my role as a creative director. Now, interestingly, I am not by training an artist. I don't draw real well. My training before I got into games was actually in live theater as a set designer and as a lighting designer and as a scenic designer. So I do have artistic training in the sense that I used to work in the arts and I used to, draw sets and things like that. So I do have some background as an artist, but I would certainly not call myself an artist. I'm a designer. And so one thing I've learned over those years is how to, as an artist or as a designer, work efficiently with artists who all know way better things about art than I do. And I've got about 10 or so tips that I want to give. I've also got some examples that I want to show of how we work with artists here in our studio. And I want to just dive right into it. And the first big tip I want to give, and if you listen to nothing else, this is what's really important about designers. The number one mistake that I see designers have is they have an image in their head. And they're a designer. They're not an artist. They've got an image in their head. They're like, I think it ought to be like this. And so they say, okay, I want this thing to be like this or to look like this. And the artist goes and makes something and they bring it back and it's perfectly good art. There's not a damn thing wrong with the art. And the designer's like, yeah, that's not really what I was thinking. I really wanted something that looked like this, right? That's not an effective way to work with artists. You're a designer. You're not an artist, right? That artist knows art. You kind of know art, but that guy really knows art, right? When somebody brings that art to you, the real question that you want to answer is this the right thing for the project? And if you have negative comments about the art, those negative comments, I mean, obviously if the art is just crap art, you can say, well, that's crap art, right? And it happens sometimes. Sometimes you look at it. And by the way, for those who don't know, the way that you tell an artist that his art is crap without saying your art's crap is you say, is that done? That looks a little rough, right? If you watch artists talk to each other, that's how artists like put each other down. They're like, oh, that looks a little rough. Is that done yet? Right? Which is how you say to an artist, that's crap. That's the polite way. But most of the time when somebody brings back art in my studio, because we have good artists in our studio, the problem is not it's crap. The problem is it doesn't work with the project. And it might not work with the project because it's in a different style from the rest of the project. Maybe the rest of the project is really saturate, uses a lot of dark, rich colors, and this is really pastel. And you put the thing next to it and you say, that's not going to work in our game because the rest of the art doesn't look like this. It's good art, but it's not the right art because of that. Or maybe we need to know something for the story. There's some information that I need to give the player, and this art doesn't convey that information. Or maybe in the situation that you're in, this art doesn't read. I need, I need it to be on a little tiny card, and it doesn't look good on a little tiny card. As long as it fits all the requirements of what you want, whether that dragon is red or green, or whether the castle looks Gothic or Romanesque, as long as it works with everything else, let it go, right? It's not about what you dreamed. And this is really important. I don't, and this goes across the project, not just to artists, but to design as well. if I always limit everything to what I've got in my head, if I say it's not good unless it's what's in my head, I've limited this game to what's in my head. And I've only got one head, right? The whole point to having a whole team of people is you've got a lot of heads. And each one of those different heads has different ideas. And if you want a project, if you want to get to that place where the team, the product of the team is greater than the product of the sum of its parts or whatever, if you want to get to that place, you need to be open to the idea that someone's going to bring you something that is absolutely not what you were thinking of, but put up against, does it work? Does it work for the game? Does it work with the rest of the art? It passes all that criteria. Let it be, right? That's how you get really good work from your artists. That's the number one rule about working with artists that I will give you. Now, there's a corollary to this, kind of a different way of thinking about it, that this comes from my business partner, Alan Simonson, who is not an artist, and he's not very good at working with artists, actually. He's a programmer and a technical director in the studio. He knows a lot about making games. And when people come to him as a coder and they say, a designer says, I need this way to do this, really detailed, whatever, Alan will always kind of stop for a second and say, what are you trying to achieve? Tell me what it is you want to do. Because he's better at this. Alan is a great programmer of tools. He knows how to make good tools. And so when I come to him and I say, blah, 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 I want all this other stuff, he'll stop me and say, tell me what you're trying to achieve. Well, what I want to do is I want to be able to make this level by doing it. And he'll say, well, actually you could do it this other different way. And suddenly Alan's expertise, or the expertise of anyone who you free up to ask you that question, is useful, right? If I'm micromanaging him down and telling him exactly how I want this tool to work, exactly how I want something to work, I'm going to maybe get exactly what I asked for. But there was the possibility of something better that could have been made that I didn't know about because I didn't know how to build that thing. But he, in his role as being someone who knew more about this, could have built for me if he had only known what I was trying to do. That thing works with art too, right? You may come to an artist and say, and Grayson, one of our artists, was actually talking about this just the other day. You could come to him and say, make this room darker. Sure, an artist can do that. He can make it darker, but the question is why? Now, if I had gone to that artist and said, in this scene, I really want it to be scary. I want the player to really feel nervous and scared about this environment. I want it to feel very mysterious. Now the artist knows what you want to do. He doesn't just know make it darker, right? He knows what it is you're trying to achieve. Now the artist may have some better suggestions for you. Okay, maybe making it darker is one thing, but hey, maybe we put this swinging light overhead that makes the light move back and forth and sometimes illuminates this and sometimes doesn't, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of things that an artist can do if he knows what it is you want to do that may be better than your idea of what it is you thought you wanted. And getting to that place is impossible if that artist doesn't know the larger scope of what you're trying to do. So that's another way of looking at it. Sometimes you don't know what you want. There are many times where I'm like, I don't have any, what does this dragon look like? I don't know. Don't care. It breathes fire. A lot of times, and I would like to pull away for a minute and go to the bottom of this, which is artists have ideas too, right? There are a lot of different careers that artists can work in. They could be virtual effect artists or visual effect artists for cinema. They can work as commercial artists. There's a thousand different jobs that an artist can do. The artists that you're working with in video games chose to be video game artists. And the reason they chose to be video game artists is because they like video games. And they probably play a lot of video games. They have ideas, right? A lot of the best design ideas that I've had in games actually came from artists. Right? This title that we put on ourselves of, I'm a designer, so I do the design. You're the artist, so you do the art. You're the programmer, so you do the programming. And nobody's allowed to have an opinion about anything else because they don't have the right title. Bullshit! That's not the way teams work, right? And especially designers need to open themselves up to the idea that everyone on the team, whether they're a programmer or a sound guy or an artist, they're in video games because they like video games. They're going to have ideas. And some of those ideas are gonna be good. You should listen to them. And every now and then, you don't have to know what you want, right? You don't have to, designers feel like, okay, I'm gonna put this character in a game. If there's no design reason why that character is a certain way or isn't a certain way, you don't have to make one up just because you're the designer, right? You can go to the artist and say, look, this character is a nurse, and the nurse shows up and does these things. What do you think the nurse ought to look like? And the designer doesn't have to say, she's Latina, she's a woman. Those assumptions that I come into it, they don't have to be like that. Maybe the artist is like, oh, I've got this really great idea for this character. He's like a big, tall black dude. He wears a little pendant around his neck. It looks good with the scrubs. Maybe that's a character he wants, right? And that two things are going to happen. One, he's going to bring his idea to the game, which if you didn't have a good idea, you didn't have to make one just because your job title says designer. And two, it means this artist is getting more invested in your project. And this is a really important thing. If you're constantly micromanaging your artists, if you're constantly telling them every little detail about what they need to do and not giving them any freedom to bring their ideas to the project, at some point they're just going to turn their heads off and they're going to go, I don't know, just tell me what you want. Just tell me what you want to draw and I'll go draw it. And if you ever get to that point in your project, you kind of up, right? You've really lost the value of an artist at that point. Now, that's not always the case. Some artists are going to come to you and they're going to be like, dude, I don't want to think about this. Just tell me what you want me to draw. And sometimes they do. They just want you to give them the, and that's fine. If that's the case, if their artist comes back to you and says, I don't know, what do you want him to look like? Have a little conversation, sort something out. But if you don't have a reason for needing something to be a certain way, be upfront and open about it, because that's a place where the artist can step in and use their sort of artsy abilities to make your game better. On all of this, I want to keep in mind that there's no hierarchy. There's no, this whole thing, and this is one of the things that bothers me the most about the video game industry, is how into titles we have become. If you go look at the game credits of any Boomzap game, you will note we don't usually list leads. We don't. I only show up once in the game credits. I show up as creative director. That's it. I don't show up as designer or anything else. I don't need that thing in my life. Everybody's just listed alphabetically by their last name, and I do that very much on purpose. Because I know someday down the road they might need to go ask for a job from a company that's not as, I don't know, communistic minded as me. I do sort it by category and say, you were an artist on the project. So they can go at some point and say, I was an artist on this project. But this whole concept of I'm a lead artist or I'm a lead designer and you're a junior designer, so my way goes. This is a really bad way to make creative content. Not just in games, but across the board. If you go to the top companies in the world that are making creative content, they don't work like that. They don't have some guy at the top of the pyramid who says, well, I'm a lead designer, and because I'm a lead designer, right? It doesn't, creative content isn't built like that. Creative content is built by small groups of people that talk about what they want and they talk about the results, and they don't get into pissing arguments about who's lead or who's not, or who's a designer or who's an artist. I don't care who came up with the idea. If the idea is a good idea, we do the good idea, right? And that's the way that you need to approach this if you want to have a good, happy team. Ask questions. One of the big things I see is people are very worried about looking stupid when they're faced with people who have skills, right? If we look at a computer game artist is one of the most highly trained, skilled people in the modern world. These people have spent years learning Photoshop. They've learned 3D Max or Maya. They've learned all these complicated tools. They've learned about color theory. They've learned about design. If you meet a 27-year-old professional computer artist, I can bet that when they were like 6, they had a sketchbook full of sketches that they were doing with pencil, right? Almost always, right? This is something that's taken them a long time to learn. And the idea that you, as a designer, know everything they know is ridiculous. So be honest about it. When you don't know something, ask about that thing. If you look at something and it doesn't look right to you, it doesn't look good to you, ask. This doesn't look good to me. What's weird about this? I'm looking at this piece of art, I'm looking at this other piece of art, and I like art A and I don't like art B. What's different between these two? What's going on here, right? Artists love to have you ask questions. Artists love to talk about their work, right? Put your ego aside. You're dealing with highly, highly trained professionals who know a lot more about what they're doing than you do. Ask them. So this is the biggest thing. Stop writing big, long design documents with lots of words. Nobody reads them. I've told this story 1,000 times, but it's true. For years and years, I used to always, when I wrote these big, long design documents, I used to put a line somewhere in the document that said, if you read this sentence, please come to my desk and I'll give you $5. I used to put that in every design document I wrote. And I went something like 8 years in the industry and nobody ever asked for their $5, right? Your big, long, wordy design documents do not get read. I promise you that. I have moved. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do documents. It doesn't mean you don't document things. Of course you document things, but you change the way you document things. If I have to use text, I use bullet points. I use an Excel sheet with breakout. One of the projects that we're working with, the entire design document is literally an Excel sheet that walks through, this is what happens at these given points, this is the data, and you can actually read through it very, very quickly. I don't believe in big, long design docs. When you are talking to artists, use more pictures, right? If I tell an artist, I want a green dragon, what does that mean? Is it a Chinese looking green dragon? Is it a Western looking green dragon? Does it have wings? Does it have 4 legs? Are the wings its front legs? Is it an angry dragon? Is it a pretty dragon? Now I can write all of that out laboriously, but no matter what I write, it is going to be subject to the designer thinking that he explained it and the artist interpreting those words the best way that they can. Just go look for some pictures. We live in this wonderful age where the internet has a picture of anything, right? If you think to yourself, I want a mecha centaur, type in mecha centaur and you'll get a mecha centaur. Won't be the mecha centaur you're looking for, but it'll be a mecha centaur. And now you've got somewhere to start with. And you can show that picture of whatever mecha centaur you found and start drawing little arrows at it and say, I don't really like the way that his head looks, or I think it ought to be bigger, or it ought to be stronger, or blah, 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 blah. But at least now we have a frame of reference. Oh, it's like this mecha centaur, but, right? Oh, I think this mecha centaur ought to have a Japanese style helmet, right? What is a Japanese? Go Japanese style helmet, stick it right next to him, show them that's what you want, right? The artist is going to look at that. He's going to very quickly understand what you want. Now, this is the important thing. Talk them through it. Before you start any art task, right? Show them this thing and then walk them through it. Get them on the phone, talk them through it, right? Get them in the meeting room with you and talk them through it. This is kind of what I'm looking for. And what you're doing in this point is you're doing that thing that I talked about a couple slides ago, which is you're giving them context. You're letting them understand why you want a mecha centaur. How is it going to be used? How often does it show up in the game? Is he a friendly centaur? Is he a happy centaur? Is he angry? What tribe does he come from? What kind of things am I going to do with it? The more information the artist has about what you're going to do with his piece of art, the better they're going to be able to do something for you, right? And the talking them through it isn't just you giving them a lecture. It's also the chance for that artist to say, hey, I heard all the stuff that you just said, but you know what? Instead of a mecha centaur, what if, bleh, right? And the whatever's about to come out of his mouth may be really cool. Because again, this is a guy that's been doing art for a really, really long time. And this person has great ideas and you want them to shove their great ideas in your game. And this is their chance. Before you start doing anything else, when you go through this discussion, this is the chance for them to get involved, right? One of the best artists I ever worked with was a young woman from the Philippines named Karen. She's now a freelance artist in the Philippines. Wonderful, wonderful person. And she had a lot of ideas. about games. She had a lot of ideas about how the user interface should work, how this character should look, etc., etc. And the more I worked with her, the more I realized I needed to make sure, and this is one of the ways I really learned about this, talked them through it, thought, she needed a chance somewhere in the process where somebody let her in to the design. Because artists sometimes are a little scared. Artists are sometimes scared that they're going to piss somebody off or they're going to make somebody upset. If you don't give them this moment to get into the design where you're actively asking them, what do you think about this? And that's a big thing you should ask. When you're talking about your Mecha Centaur, what do you think? Do you think it should have a Japanese helmet? Now the artist has an in. Now the artist can be like, sounds kind of silly to me, a Mecha Centaur with a Japanese helmet. Maybe we should do something different, right? Giving them this opportunity to get involved is how you get the great work from them. And I wanted to shout out to Karen because she's one of the people that really taught me this. A really wonderful artist and really opened my eyes to how involved an artist can be from the very beginning if you get them involved. Because there was a negative lesson there as well. There were projects I worked on with Karen where I didn't talk them through what I wanted to have happen. And she kind of bottled up. And she said, I really think we should have done it this way or that way. There's a bunch of stuff that I would have done if anyone had asked me, but nobody asked me. And that, I could blame it on Karen, but I have to look at myself as the creative director of the game and say, that was my fault for not involving this great artist earlier. So that's a thing I wanted to talk about. And a shout out to Karen. This slide is kind of an example of how we do this. This is actually directly from some of the work that we're doing on Last Regiment. Now, I wanted to have a thing in my game. I called them trench orcs, and I wanted them. Our game is set in sort of this post-apocalyptic fantasy, whatever. It's a complicated game, but basically, it's a fantasy world that has reached almost to like the 1700s in terms of its technology and whatnot. And it's experienced a great big cataclysmic event where it's gotten a huge infection of fungus. I know I'm not selling that well. I should probably get a better 30-second speech about what I'm. Anyway, here's one of our characters. And when I talked about going out and finding references, this is actually directly from one of the documents. I have a great big document where each character that I wanted the artist to draw has a style sheet like this. Now, this is obviously not the end of the conversation. This was the beginning of the conversation. This is where I said, this is kind of what I'm thinking. And I believe I worked on this piece of art with an artist named June. June is that's a dude's name, Jun, June. June is a wonderful artist out of the Philippines, very experienced, very, very high quality artist. But he's the kind of artist that he likes a little bit more input at the beginning so that he can work from that. So this is what I gave him. Now you'll notice I was very specific about a few things. I was like, this hat. I knew I wanted this hat. This is a cool hat. This cool German spiky helmet. I totally wanted that. So I was like, this hat. Now obviously if he had come back and said, Chris, that hat's stupid, you can't do that, we would have had that discussion. Now, because of the story of the game and the fact that these people are dealing with this fungal infection that's covered the world with these great big huge massive mushrooms and these spores that they breathe that makes them sick and takes over their bodies, this group of people are fighting that by using these sort of steampunk gas masks. And so I could have said steampunk gas mask, but you know what? I went online and I typed in steampunk gas mask and that popped up. And I was like, yeah, something like that, right? And then orc. What's an orc look like? I went online and found, if you type orc in a Google search, you will find a lot of orcs. This is kind of the orc I was thinking about when I was thinking about orcs, right? So here's kind of where we started. Now I want to actually show you, this is what the end art looked like. This is the trench orc from our game, right? This is actually if I scroll down here, here's the final trench orc that showed up in our game. And it's a great piece of art. I like this art a lot. This is one of my favorite units in the game. This guy is awesome. And look, he's got a lot of the stuff that I wanted. He looks kind of like that big dude. He's kind of got that kind of orky face. June kind of made up his own thing with the weapons and whatnot, but he's got the cool helmet that I wanted. Right across the board, this is a wonderful sort of this is cool, right? And I want to go back all the way to the beginning. This is where we started. This was the first piece, and I wish I saved more of these things. I really should save a better sort of library of the conversations that we had. But this is one of the first pieces of art that June put together for this back in July 29th, 2018. You can tell this is pretty close, right? Now, in this particular case, I felt that June was pretty much on track. I looked at this piece of art, and I did not have a lot to add to this. And that's okay, right? If there's nothing else I could tell designers, looking at a piece of art that an artist does and saying, I got no problem with that. Wonderful, right? And this was one of those situations, right? So then he put together, there were some intermediary steps here, but it ended up being this. And I wish I'd put together all the intermediary steps because there was some more work done. You can see this is where he was changing the face around a little bit and some other things. But it ended up being this piece of art. Now, you'll notice this is on Basecamp, which we use as a sort of place to store images and to walk through this. Now, I know some people are like, well, you talked a lot about talking back and forth between each other. Where's all the conversation and the notes between, you know, this image and the next image? They're not here because that way of doing it, where you look at an image and you type out a little book and then they read the little book that you typed out and they type out, that is a slow, stupid way of doing this, right? In between each one of these, I went over to Slack, which is where our company actually runs the studio. That's our sort of office. We're a totally virtual studio. So I'm actually up here in Yokohama, Japan. He's down there in Manila in the Philippines. And we're on Slack chatting to each other between each one of these versions where I was like, hey, this, hey, that. And I'm grabbing screenshots and drawing a little circle, putting it in Slack, and then chatting with him real quick. Online in real time. Goes much faster. With other artists, I might even pick up the phone or, you know, the microphone and headset in the modern world and chat with them directly. But you'll notice there's not a bunch of big, long books of text in between these because, again, nobody reads that. Takes a really long time to do. It's a difficult way to work. Don't do that, right? I want to show you another example. This was with a different artist. This was another character from the same game. I wanted to have a healer riding a butterfly. That was kind of a thing I wanted. And I kind of didn't really know what I wanted, but I knew I wanted it to be a woman, and I wanted her to be on a butterfly, and I wanted her to look friendly, right? And this is a case where I kind of gave, the artist on this is a guy named Mark. He's another wonderful Filipino artist. By the way, the Philippines has a lot of amazing artists. This is another great artist in the Philippines, a guy named Mark. And Mark looked at this and he was like, Chris, I've got an idea. Just let me show you what I'm thinking, right? And Mark put together that, right? And I was like, hell yeah, Mark. That's cool. Now let's go back in time a little bit. This is the final image. This was the original image that he put. Now you'll notice Mark works a little bit differently from June, right? Mark actually has a more cartoony kind of style. He went straight for, you know, a very rough color wash. If you go back to the way June works, June actually likes to start with a rough sketch. There's not one in here, but there was in this process of value art. I'll show you what I'm talking about when I talk about value art. This is another piece of work from June, who's one of my favorite artists in the world, by the way. I love working with June. June likes to get very quickly to something like this, which is showing all of the value, showing all the brightness and darkness of each one of the things in black and white. Mark thinks in color, so Mark tends to give you something like that. Again, let your artists work how they want to work. If Mark works this way and June works that way, don't get all up in their grill about it. Trust me, they've been learning how to do this for 20 some odd years. Leave them be and let them work the way they work. So this is what Mark gave me. Really nice piece of art. And I really didn't have a lot to add here. I was like, yeah, that's it. Color it. And again, boom, we get this wonderful, beautiful piece of art. I was really proud to have that in the game. This is a you know, objectively that's great art. And this was largely me just kind of leaving an artist alone to get their stuff done. I'll give you another example. This is Queen Sawtooth. Same game, different character. With Queen Sawtooth, I had a pretty clear vision in my head of what I wanted. And the big thing I wanted was, man, I wanted to ride a great big old lizard. And I found this picture somewhere online of a lizard riding a lizard, and I was like, that's pretty cool. It's a lizard riding a lizard. And then I realized that lizard's just an iguana, right? Somebody somewhere had drawn a lizard riding an iguana. And I was like, iguanas are cool. So here's an iguana. I went out and found an iguana, right? And I actually really liked the composition of this in terms of how it would fit our game. I felt that this lizard looked very regal riding on top of this other lizard. But for our game, she's part of a goblin tribe. And in our game, the goblin tribes are sort of a tribal people. They live in the woods. They're very different than goblins in other games. In most games, goblins are like sneaky little like thieves and whatnot. Our goblins are much more like warriors from the woods. And I wanted to get that sort of warrior from the wood feel to it. And I looked at this. I found, I don't know what this thing is. I don't know. Well, I mean, it's a woman, but I don't know what kind of fantasy creature she is. But I found this, and I just kind of like the palette. I like the look of these colors. So, all right, there we go. Sexy person, kind of like Hollythorn, which is another character in our game. She's riding a big old lizard. So, here we go. This was Ate Mark again, right? So this was the first lizard that Mark gave me, and I was not okay with this, right? And I wasn't not okay with it because I didn't like the art. I wasn't okay with it because I didn't like it in the way that I knew it was going to get used, right? I was like, actually, we're going to be talking to this character, and I'm going to use this image for conversations. And if in the image of the conversations, I see this like screaming lizard, it's going to seem weird to me that this lizard is always screaming at me. This pose is too active for what I need in this particular role. So can we go with a more sedate pose, more like the one I was showing you earlier, right? To which we got this. And I was like, this is awesome, right? Now we're cooking with unleaded fuels, right? This is really, really nice. But I had one more note. And again, this note wasn't about I don't like it or make it more like this or that. The note was, she's kind of looking out of the side of her eye at me. And again, I'm going to be having direct conversations with her. Can we have her look more directly towards me? And so there was some interim arts in between this that aren't saved. But this is what we ended up with. Here she is. She's looking directly at me. She's got this wonderful feathered headdress on. She's got this great look. It's in the kind of palette. If I go back to what we asked for, this is a really wonderful interpretation of the stuff that I sent him. I think it's just really, really well done. And a lot of this, it's like cooking. Do less, right? The best meals that you eat, you messed with it the less. The best art that you get, you let the artist do their job. And this is a really good case of me just letting the artist do their job. This is one more I want to show you. I believe this one, this is some more art. Again, tribal goblins, same world, same environment. I had some pretty cool ideas of what we wanted. I knew I wanted him to have a bow and arrow. I knew I wanted him to look like a mounted horse archer, so I went and I found some references of Mongolian archers because I knew Mongolians had great horse archers. And there were 1,000 images of Mongolian horse archers, but I was looking at, what was a good pose? What was a good action pose? Because I knew this is a good chance for us to have an action pose because you're not going to be talking to this guy very much, right? So what we ended up with was this guy. We'll go directly to the end, right? And here's the thing about this one. This is pretty dead on the money, right? And let me show you the very first sketch that we got. It was this. And my input after this point, this was June. This wasn't Mark. So June drew this. My input after this was literally, yeah, June, go color that. That's awesome. Go make it happen, right? Boom. There it is. That's the final version. Now, there was an interim version in here, actually, that had a different background that we changed because when we put it in the format that we were going to use it, when we put it down into a card shape, everything got kind of muddy because the background was too close to the color of the foreground, and it didn't really pop out very much. So that's a really good example. Now I want to walk through one more example. This is another orc from our game. This is June again. You can tell I really like working with June, and I pulled out. I want to just do a big, huge shout out to June. I don't know if he's going to watch this or not, but if he does, I really, really love working with June because he's a consummate professional. He's an artist's artist, right? Every conversation I've ever had with art or with June about art has been focused on the art, focused on how we make the art better, focused on him trying to resolve the issues, me trying to resolve the issues. It's been a wonderful, great relationship. Now, I'm sorry I don't actually still have the original style sheet that I handed June. It got deleted. But there was a style sheet, much like the sheets that you were seeing before, for this character who is a crusading orc. And this was the first thing he gave me. He gave me these three images. And again, I was hit with the problem of, June, these are all way too active for the role that we need him to be in. And this is actually, I should point out, you'll notice, this is the third time I gave that note. I should have been more clear in my original remit for this particular character how it was going to be used, because I actually wasted June's time with him getting us these really, really active poses when I didn't want a very active pose. And it wouldn't just be that I should show him a non-active pose and say, put him in this pose. I should take a step further back and say, I like this pose because we're going to use him in a situation where he's having a conversation with you that's not in combat, so I need him to look like he's not in combat, right? If June had that information, I could have saved him the, I don't know, couple hours that he spent putting together a bunch of sketches before he got to this. So I showed him a new pose, actually a dwarf character from another game that we had made. And I said, I love this character. Can we do a pose like this? Boom, here's this pose. I looked at it. I wasn't real sure about his head, so I asked him to put some new heads together. This is actually out of order. The first thing we did is we got some extra heads, right? And June said, well, here's some other heads. Here's some other ways that you could look at his head. All right. I am convinced that every artist, when you tell them to give you a couple varieties, they always put one in just to make sure that you choose this one. I'm pretty sure he knew I was not going to choose this. I think we all knew that Orcacorn was not going to happen. I think this was just put there which is fine. It happens. I will tell you a story. I'll take a side note right here to tell you a little story. I was not here for this. This is back in the early days of video games. I used to play Dungeons and Dragons. The way I got into video games is I used to play D&D with a bunch of guys that worked at a game studio called Origin, which you may or may not have heard of. Origin was the company that made the original Ultima. They made Privateer and Wing Commander, a great classic old Austin studio. And I went to college in Austin, and I used to play D&D with a bunch of guys that were on the Privateer team. It was like the lead programmer and one of the producers and whatnot from the Privateer team. And they were telling me a story about the early days of Origin. It wasn't actually on the Privateer team. It was on the Wing Commander team, where there was a person on the team in the sort of creative directorly role that would constantly give feedback, and it was driving the artists crazy, right? Because you have to remember, this is back in the early 90s when rendering a scene meant that you set everything all up and you pushed the render button and you went home and you came back in the morning and you saw what the computer had made, right? Renders that now take 10 or 15 seconds back then literally took all night. And they would put these really complicated scenes together of, spaceships inside of the space hangar and blah, 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 blah. And had, a bunch of user interface and whatnot. And so this creative director guy comes in and he says, oh, the scene is great, but I don't like, these buttons. And they were like, okay, we can redo it. So they made I forget what it was, but they were like round buttons, and they made the round buttons square. And so they, render it again overnight, comes back the next day. Oh no, the square buttons just aren't doing it. Maybe we could make those buttons hexagonal. Let's make hexagonal buttons. All right, another day, another night of rendering, come back. No, they're just not working. I mean, maybe what we can do is we make this one hexagonal and this one square, and we do that. This goes for like almost a week. And finally, at the end of the week, this artist who has had this stupid task on his list all week to make these stupid buttons, he was like, look, let me just do what I want to do tonight. I'll render it out. I'll show you tomorrow, and we'll see what you think, right? And the creative director guy walks away. Artist doesn't do a damn thing. Pulls out the render from the very first day, puts it on his screen, and the next morning shows it to him. And the creative director's like, that's exactly what I've been looking for, right? And this artist was about ready to punch him in the face. He was just like, I can't believe I wasted a week just so you could come and piss on this lamppost. It was really, really irritating for him. So the next time they had another task, he was building a big space hangar and had all these spaceships and all this other stuff in it. And he said he built this whole thing, and when he was done, he rendered everything out, he just grabbed a little tiny rubber duck, and he just stuck the little rubber duck underneath one of the spaceships. And the creative director guy comes in, he looks at it, he's like, oh my God, that's so great. Why is the duck there? Can you just get rid of the duck? And the artist was like, yeah, I can totally get rid of the duck. And he realized that's what it was. This creative director just felt this unreal need to piss on this guy's art so that he could say that he was involved, right? And from that point on, they would always put a duck in every scene. It wasn't actually a duck, but they would put something obviously wrong in every single scene so that this creative director could have something to bitch about so that they could pull it out and they would be done. There was always an obvious flaw in every single piece of art that they did so that this creative director could find the obvious flaw and resolve it, right? Now, as a side note, I was actually the producer for the original Far Cry 1. I lived and worked in Coburg, Germany, and worked with a Crytek team. I was a producer for the first Far Cry. And I told this story to the guys there. And they thought it was funny. And so they actually got off the internet somewhere a rubber duck 3D model. And they used to put this stupid rubber duck in every single level of Far Cry just to see if I'd played it, right? So I would be playing through the level, and they would always put it somewhere funny. It would be like little tiny on a shelf somewhere, or it would be like, in the backpack of somebody. If you played the level, you would find the duck, and if I played a level and had comments on it, they'd be like, Chris, where's the duck? Because they want to know if I played the level or not. And it's true, they're still there. If you go back and play the original Far Cry, every single level of Far Cry, to my knowledge, still has that stupid rubber duck in it somewhere. One of the levels, I believe that rubber duck is literally the size of a ship, and it's like parked in a bay behind one of the islands. And if you go to this one part of the island that nobody goes to, there's this huge, 10-meter long rubber duck floating in the water, and it's real. It's like it's modeled. You can push it. But I've gotten on a tangent. But that's a fun war story for you if you're interested in that sort of thing. Getting back to June's art here, I feel a little bit like I was rubber ducked a little bit here. I feel like June was like, I don't know. I got 3 ideas. You told me to give you 4. Here, this is stupid. So anyway, fine. Artists do that sometime. Let them do it. This is kind of your signal that the artist would really like you to choose this one or this one. So we chose this one. He looks great. We put this together. Now, this was June's original color wash for this. Really, really nice piece of art, but it looked a little bit dingy to me. And again, I knew that we were going to be seeing this art at a small size. It's going to be put on a card. And I thought all of these beautiful details that June's put in, they're really going to run together when we put it in a card. And at this point, I actually said, June, I actually showed him, I sunk it down to the size of a card, and I showed him in the game how it would look. And he was like, oh yeah, that's a little bit dingy. And so we took some of these dark reds and browns, and we actually turned them white like this. And then we can see we brightened up the armor. We did some other stuff. I think later on we even pulled off some of this other stuff, and we got him. You can see this model is a lot brighter, a lot more visually interesting at small sizes. And again, those comments weren't about me wanting it to be a certain way. They were, look, I put this piece of art on a card. I put the card in the game. You can see what it looks like. And immediately, this wasn't about me versus June. It was about June and I versus a problem. And with artists, you really want to get to that space. You really want to explain, this is what I'm trying to solve. This is the problem I'm having. You're the artist. Tell me how to solve this problem. Go back to that original, the original 2 things in the lecture. Is it good for the project? If it's not, we need to solve that problem, right? So that's an example of that. Um, we got to this part, looks really good. Again, we were worried about the background because it kind of blended in. And this is an interesting point. We then put this in front of this background, and you can totally see, wow, this art really pops here. Right? Looking at this versus this was good art. This really just jumps out at you as being like, wow, that's really powerful, especially at small sizes in the context that we were using it, right? And this was about the fourth time I had given this note to the artists about, hey, when you're putting these characters together, they're going to be pretty small and muddy at small sizes, so let's make sure that they really contrast against the background so that I can really clearly see them. Once you've given a note like that 2 or 3 times, you need to write that stuff down. You need to make that part of the remit, because I'm working with a lot of different artists on this project. And when I bring a new artist in, I want to take all of those learnings that we had from the last couple times I was working with the artists and say, that's a thing that we did this wrong, we did that wrong, we did these other things wrong. This is how we can actually make this go a little faster. Keeping a record of the decisions you made and why you made them as a sort of style guide for new people to come onto the project. This is extremely powerful for artists. So that's a bunch of examples. I've got some more things I want to talk about. Let's see here. We've already talked about that. So this, you can obviously see this is kind of related to the stuff I was just talking about a minute ago. Look at works in progress often, right? We have a rule in our studio that if you're working on, say, a 2D piece of art like the ones I was just showing you, I want to see a work in progress twice a day. I want to see during, like, right before you go to lunch and right before you quit during the day. And this is not me. Again, we work in a virtual studio. I have no idea what these guys are doing wherever they are, right? They are in Manila or Jakarta or Singapore or somewhere. They're doing some work somewhere. Me wanting to check their work twice a day is not about me making sure they're working. That's not it. I'm trying to save them time, right? If they work for 3 days on something and I haven't seen it and I look at it and I'm like, oh my God, that's totally not going to work. I've literally just wasted 3 days of their life, right? And I don't want to do that. I don't ever want to, because I'm paying for those days, right? I'm paying for that work. So I want to make sure that as they're going through the process, they're not going off on some weird tangent or doing something totally wrong. And there's been a couple cases where I looked at something, a day in, and I was like, whoa, that thing, that's these are the reasons why that's not going to work. And the artist was like, oh, okay, I get it. And we totally changed it. And changing stuff early on is cheap. Changing stuff late is expensive. Now, the other thing I would say is look at them in context. All that stuff I just talked about a second ago about taking that art and putting it on a card, usually I demand that the artists work that way. So I literally just this morning, I was looking at a piece of art, new character that was being drawn for a different game, a game I can't talk about, I'm afraid. And it was a good looking piece of art, but I was like, I'm not going to give you I'm not going to respond to this art because it's not in context. Take that art, shove it on top of whatever it is you're working on, and show me what this looks like, where it's going to be. Now, I know in a lot of games, they're like, oh, I don't have the technical ability to get this into the game, or it's a lot of work to get it into the game. If you can get it into the game very quickly, do that. If you can't, that's why God made Photoshop, right? You can Photoshop what you're doing onto a screenshot of what you're working on and get a very quick mock-up of what this is going to look like in real life very, very quickly. And I strongly suggest you do that. If you're doing a 3D game where you're making characters for a 3D game, take a screenshot of the scene and show me that right on top of that screenshot. Now I can look at, does the colors look right? Does the style look right? There's a lot of stuff about, the line thickness of details and blah, blah, blah. You'll know. If you put it on top of, if you put it where it goes, you'll know. If you put, I've seen a lot of times where like, okay, we're going to make these characters, and they show me a lineup of characters, which is sometimes useful. You can look at the lineup of characters and be like, oh yeah, they all kind of look like they come from the same universe. But I want to see that lineup in the game. I don't want to see them against a gray background. I want to see, these are what your character is going to look like, where they're going to be used. This is what this scene is going to look like, where it's going to be used. If you're not looking at it that way and you're giving feedback, you're possibly giving wrong feedback because you're giving that feedback without the full context. Also, forcing the artists to put their art in context forces them to constantly be looking at things like, hey, you know what? This only shows up, that big on screen. Maybe I shouldn't spend all day, making all the details. I'll tell you another war story. I've got two for this. One Alan was involved in, and one what Alan wasn't. I'll tell the one Alan was involved in. We were working. Alan and I used to work for a studio called Viz in Scotland. It was in Dunfermline, Scotland. Which, if you ever get the chance to go to Dunfermline, don't. That place sucks balls. But anyway, we used to work in Dunfermline, Scotland, and we were working on this game. I wasn't actually working on it. Alan was working on it. I was working on a different game in the same studio. Alan was working on this game called State of Emergency, which was a sort of open world Grand Theft Auto kind of thing where I don't know, it was one of those things. The view of the game was, the camera was looking down on this group of people that are running around the city breaking stuff, right? And we had been told, because this was right when the PlayStation 2 was brand new, and we've been told, don't worry about polygons. You can put all the polys you want in because of some fabulous new technology or whatever, which was all wrong, of course. And so the artists went out and just modeled everything with this absurd number of polygons, thousands and thousands and thousands of polygons, way more than we ever could have drawn, right? And they built this, was a tower, was like a, what do you call it? A crane, one of those cranes that you build stuff with. And they had actually modeled the inside of the crane all the way down to here's the buttons that you turn and stuff in the crane. But here's the thing. You could never go in the crane. You couldn't do it. There was no way in the game to ever get in the crane. What's even worse is the way the camera works. The top of the crane was above the camera. Literally, the whole section that they had drawn didn't exist in the game. The camera was going to go underneath the crane, and they had not only modeled the crane that you were going to be underneath, they had literally modeled the buttons on they didn't know the context of what it was they were building, and they went and built what they thought was good art. And it was a nice looking crane, but it was a complete waste of time. Every minute that was spent on that task was wasted money, right? So forcing them to show you the work in context forces them to do the work in context and make those decisions about, hey, you know what? Maybe I don't have to model any of this crap at all. Or maybe this... I'll tell you one other story. We had a texture artist. This is back at Crytek when I was working on Far Cry. And we had a texture artist who was doing textures for all of the weapons. And we had this, one of our programmers was going through trying to optimize the game, and he was like, oh my God, our texture budget is way, way over budget. Somebody's used a lot of textures. And we started looking at the different textures that have been used. And we found the texture for the bullet. Not the gun, the bullet in the gun, right? And the back of the bullet, the texture for the back of the bullet, which at any given time in the game was a pixel, if that, right? The texture for the back of that bullet actually was, I forget how big it was some enormous, 1024 or something size pixel or size texture. And you could actually read the name of the bullet manufacturer on the back of this. The bullet literally never showed up in the game any bigger than, if you put your binoculars on and stared at the ground and focused in all the way, you might have seen that big, it was crazy. And that wasn't just a cost in terms that the artist wasted time making that texture. It was a cost in that texture was in the game because he didn't understand the concept of, he didn't understand the context. If anyone had ever really explained to him what he was just told, make a cool bullet texture. And in his mind, artists will do what you tell them to do. He made a cool texture. So look at stuff in context. All right. And this gets back to what I was just talking about a second ago. Be super clear on the limitations, right? How is this piece of art going to be used? How much texture budget do you have? How many polys am I allowed to use? How much screen space is this actually going to take up, right? Is it going to be huge? Is it going to be something that fills the whole screen? Is it going to be something that's just over in a corner somewhere? Is it going to be something that's way over there that the player's never going to be able to get near, so it's always only going to be that tall, right? All of these things matter to an artist when he's drawing stuff. If he doesn't have that information, he's going to default to, I made it good. And good means big, detailed. If you let an artist free without giving them any sort of, boundaries, they're going to go make the best art they can because they're artists. That's what they do. but the best art that they can make is not necessarily what you need. One way that I would suggest having this happen is put in placeholders. If you're making a 3D game where you're going to be fighting zombies, right? The internet's got zombies, right? The Unity store's got zombies. Go grab it. You don't have to use it in your game. Go grab a zombie, right? Stick that zombie in. Get your gameplay working. Get everything working with placeholders. You're going to be exploring a castle. Well, mock up the castle with gray box walls and all that other stuff. Get everything kind of gray boxed and working. So now when you're going to talk to the artist about what they're going to go build, you can actually show them. You can be like, look, right there, that castle right there, that's where you're going to be using this thing. Oh, this statue that you're building, that shows up on that balcony over there, and I can never go over there, so it's only ever going to be that high. Now the artist has all this information. They can see it in context. And more importantly, if you built your tool chain right, your pipeline right, they can actually take whatever they're building and stick it in and look at it as they're building, right? Build your world with placeholders, however you're building it, then get your art in. That's a way more efficient and better way to work. Learn their tech. If you are going to be spending the rest of your career working as a game designer, you ought to know how to run Photoshop. You ought to have at some point in your life built something in 3D Max or Maya or Blender. You should know, and for God's sakes, if you're working on a game with a proprietary engine, you ought to know how that engine works, right? If you're a designer working in a game that's got a proprietary user interface tool, you should know how that tool works. Not necessarily because you're doing it to finalize game tasks, but because you need to know what's hard and what's easy. I am consistently blown away by stupid shit designers say because they have no idea what the people that they're working with are doing. They'll be like, oh, can you just do this thing? And you're like, well, you don't understand that just this thing that you're asking for is a week's worth of work. Or on the other side, I've watched designers bend over backwards because they were told, oh, this can't do that, when it was only a 5-minute job to make this thing do that, right? You're learning these tools not because you're planning on going into Photoshop and building all the assets yourself. You're learning them so that you can actually have an educated discussion with the people who are going to use these tools about the things that you're asking them to do. And you can actually start understanding when they come back to you and say, that's difficult to do or that's easy to do. Now, you're not going to go out and buy a copy of Photoshop and learn it tomorrow, right? By all means do if you can. But the way to get from where you are right now to there is actually to start asking questions, right? When you start saying, hey, can we do this thing? And someone says, that's maybe a little difficult. Oh, walk me through it. What do you have to do to make that happen, right? They're happy to tell you. They're happy to walk you through all that. And sometimes that conversation can be very illuminating because they'll say, oh, I can't do that because I have to do blah, 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 blah. And the actual answer is, oh, I don't actually want all that other stuff that you think you have to do to make it work. I just want this thing, which gets me back to Alan's original point of tell them what it is you want to do and they'll probably find a way to get it, right? These conversations, and this is the real thing I want you to take away from this is, more than anyone else in the game studio, designers have to be willing to listen and talk to people, whether it's programmers or artists or sound technicians, understanding their challenges. And this slide goes doubly for working with programmers. Most of what I'm talking about right now also is true for working with programmers. But if the more you understand about how computers work and how code works, not because you're going to go write code, but because you want to know this thing I'm asking for is going to be hard to do, or it's going to be easy to do. The number one thing that I think makes me a successful producer in the game industry is I'm not a very good coder, but I know enough about code to kind of know how things get built so that I kind of know this is a difficult thing or this is an easy thing that I'm asking for. I'm not a very good artist, but I know enough about art to know, this thing that you're wanting is going to be difficult. This thing that you're wanting is going to be hard. Now, obviously this changes. I didn't work in 3D games for quite a while. We built 2D games at Boomzap for many, many years. And I got out of touch with the 3D art pipelines. And we went back into making 3D games last year. And I realized there's a lot of new tools. There's a lot of new tech that I don't know about. And I've been spending time getting myself back up to date on those tools and tech, not because I have any intention of using them, but because I need to understand the people that are working with me that are using them. This is a critical part of your education as a game designer. Learn the basics of art, right? Color theory, composition, basic design. This is not hard to learn. YouTube will teach you the basics of this in a couple days, right? This isn't rocket science, right? And it's good. It's good for you to know this stuff. But here's the thing. Shut the f up about it when you know it, right? Nothing is worse than having some friggin' designer who just learned about the golden proportion or something, is some basic art thing. Nothing is more cringy than to watch that guy mansplain it to some artist who's been doing this shit for 20 years. Oh my God, I hate to see that happen. Oh, it's the worst. It's just, don't be that guy, right? You need to know this stuff. You need to know your basic color theory. You need to know what the difference between value and hue. You should know that, right? Those words should not be those words have a very specific meaning in the world of art, and you should know that, right? You should understand how the color wheel works. You should understand basic compositional theory. None of this is magical, but for the love of sweet Jesus, don't try to explain it to an artist because they know this stuff, right? You want to be able to have an educated conversation about this stuff, right? If what you mean to say is this needs to be more saturate, or I think this other piece of art is really saturate and yours is really not, then you need to use the right words, right? But remember that the person you're talking to knows all of this way better than you. If they've gotten to the point of being a professional digital artist, they either went to school or they've watched a million YouTube. They know all of this. You're not going to teach them this, but you do, in the same way that you need to know about their tools, you also need to know about the theory of what that they're doing. And this is basic education for a game designer. I could go on about what YouTube knows, right? There's a million, composition 101, blah, blah. The internet knows all of this. Go learn it so that you can actually speak like an educated person. Artists want to get all this stuff right. Artists really, really want to do the right job. And this is, I'm almost at the end here. This is a really strong takeaway. When you get in a discussion with an artist and they don't seem to be doing what it is you want them to do, that is time for you to really listen. It's not time for you to push and say, no, it needs to be like this because that's what I want. This is your opportunity to quietly listen and say, why is it that you think my idea is a bad idea? Walk me through it. I want to understand what it is you have. I want to understand your problem, because they're not trying to be a dick about this. They're not trying to be difficult. They heard what you said, and either A, they don't understand it, or B, they did understand it and they think you're wrong, right? Either one of those is resolved by you listening and talking and understanding what it is that they know, right? So when you get to that part where an artist kicks back, that is not the time for you as a designer to get your hackles up and, I don't know what I'm talking about, I'm right. I just did my 5 minutes worth of color theory lessons on the internet. Shut the fuck up and listen, right? This is an important thing for designers to do. And then there's one last note, and this is the last thing I wanted to talk about. There is a famous saying that no art is ever finished. It's always just abandoned. That every artist at some point just says, I can't work on this anymore, and they stop. You can beat any piece of art into the ground if you want. You can micromanage it. You can, we need to change this, and we could make this a little... You may have 1,000 notes. We're not making fine art here. We're making video games. Most of the art that goes into video games, players don't really look at it that long. They're not that critical. Once you get to the 80-20 point of it's pretty damn close, most cases, unless it's a critical piece of art in your game, that's enough, right? Games are expensive, and one of the biggest expenses in video games, when you look at the bulk expense of making a game, one of the biggest bulk expenses is a whole bunch of artists doing a whole bunch of work. And you can take a budget and increase it by 50% or 100% very, very quickly just by not letting stuff that's good enough be good enough, right? Every now and then you got to pick something and be like, this has to be perfect. But a lot of stuff in the game, good enough is good enough. I will tell you one final sort of war story about working at Crytek. For those of you who played Far Cry 1, you remember there were mutants in the back half of the game. The first half of the game, it was you versus soldiers. The back half of the game is you versus mutants. And one of the big challenges that we had was getting the mutants right. What do the mutants look like? Do the mutants look like this, or do they look like that? And we went through, I don't know how many versions of mutants, and okay, these mutants don't look good, these mutants don't animate good, blah, 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 blah. I don't remember how many versions of mutants we went through, but it was a lot. And every time we went through a new version of mutants, I mean, it wasn't just concept art. It was a concept art, and then we modeled them, and we rigged them, and we animated them, we got them in the game, and we trained the AI to run them properly. And I mean, it was a lot of time and effort just to have somebody somewhere in the chain of command say, that's not right, go back to the drawing board and make me new mutants. And I don't remember how many times we did that. When the game shipped and when it was all over, I actually took all the concept art I put up on a wall, and I got a couple people that had nothing to do with the game whatsoever. And I said, point at the mutant on the wall that looks best. Which one of these mutants? None of the mutants, from the first one to the second one to the 9th one, or however many we did, none of the mutants was definitively better than any of the other mutants. Now, we probably spent on that project $50,000, $100,000 just on mutants, just on making different, I don't even know how much, probably more than $100,000 just on going around and around and around with these stupid mutants. We could have taken the first ones that we hated, and most people would have liked them just as much as they didn't like the mutants we actually shipped with. But we certainly spent a lot of money getting there. You can do that very quick on a project. When something is done, it's done. Just let it go. Not everything has to be perfect. If it's good enough, it's good enough. People play games because they like gameplay. If the art is great, the art is great. But you can beat something into the ground. As a small indie studio, you don't have that luxury, right? I will shout out to a game I've played a lot lately, Slay the Spire. Wonderful game. Much fun. Looks good. But you know what? There's a whole lot of unfinished or, pretty close art in it. That's not an artistic masterpiece of a game. But you know what? It's making a fortune. People are loving it. It's a fun game to play because there's a lot of places in that game where those developers were like, this is good enough. This is good enough to prove our point. We move on, right? And you can look at example after example of games that do that. And it's okay. So there. That is my, I should have a screen for the end of this, but I don't. But here's what I'll do. I'll go back to the opening screen. Note to self: make end screen next time. That's the end of my presentation. I don't know if this is useful to anyone. I don't know how long this ended up being. I think it ended up being about 40 minutes. If you liked this, let me know. I'm hopefully going to be doing more of these on different topics and different subjects. I'll try to keep it very brief to the point like this. I'll try to keep it very actionable stuff. If anyone has any ideas on what they would like to hear me talk about in the future, I am absolutely happy to hear that. I promise not to talk too much about my game, but I'll pitch it just a little bit. You can see down at the bottom, there's all the links that you can go to if you're interested in the game that I'm building right now. It's called Last Regiment. It's a turn-based fantasy, simultaneous turn-based fantasy tactical strategy game for PC. It's in early access on Steam right now. By all means, go check it out. If you want to talk to me about any of this stuff, directly right there is the Discord link. I'm always in Discord. Come talk to me about any of this stuff in Discord. I'm happy to hear it. And let me know where you found this video, because I'm very curious where it ends up. All right, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. All right, Carlo, and that's where you will edit it out, and that part will be done.